Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time. Welcome to the Brain People Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Binus, and today I am practicing my deep radio voice, as you can tell. And if you want to make a comment on that, whether I should keep this or not, please do. And I'm joined by my co-host today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Katie Cruz. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist.
All right. Thanks for joining. And today we have a special episode. It is a Q&A episode. And the Q part is from you. So thank you so much for sending in all your questions. And we're going to do our best to get through as many questions as we can today. If we don't get to your question, don't be discouraged. Keep sending in questions and we will try to get to all the questions eventually. But these are really good questions and I'm excited to dive right into them. So the first question is from Sandra. And she actually has several questions, all of which I think are important. But she starts with, how can you boost your EQ?
Yeah, so let's just start with maybe some of us don't know what EQ is. So EQ stands for Emotional Intelligence Quotient. And this is a big question, how to boost your EQ, because EQ can be divided into multiple parts. And so, just to review the four main parts, and I was talking to you about this earlier, we probably have to have a whole episode or a series of episodes on this. But the first component is to be more aware. So if you're highly emotionally intelligent, you're aware of your own emotions, right? So it starts with you, awareness of your emotions. The second component is then to be able to manage those emotions. So sometimes we're aware, but we're not able to manage. The third component of emotional intelligence is then to be aware of others' emotions. And then the last component is kind of bringing them all together and then being able to manage your relationships. So when we're answering the question, how to boost your EQ, we can start thinking about practical steps for each of those components. And so I think for those that are listening or watching, they can start thinking, well, what are those areas? Maybe do a self-assessment. Do I struggle with the most? Let's say start with number one. Do I struggle with identifying and being aware of my emotions? Do I immediately dissociate? Do I numb my emotions? Do I suppress my emotions? If that's the case, then I'm just going to start with number one, right? How do I start sitting with my emotions, being more mindful, being aware of my body and the emotions that are coming up for me? Some people might say, oh, I'm very aware, but I don't know how to manage them, right? So if it's anxiety, what can I do? And we've talked in other episodes of some tips already of how to manage your emotions, including from a cognitive behavioral therapy standpoint of what can I do with my thoughts, because our thoughts are what then feed our emotions. So that could be a practical step of boosting my EQ from a perspective of managing my emotions. If I struggle with then identifying it in other people, then how can I start being more aware? And this also goes back to mindfulness, because many times we're on our phones or we're distracted or not being fully present. So how do I start just being present with people around me and trying to identify, not mind read, but identify the emotions that they're expressing? And then the last component, managing my relationships, is how do I then take all those things and also think about communication? Do I do a lot of passive aggressive communication or do I do assertive communication? And just starting to reflect on what areas in my relationships can I also improve.
Absolutely. And one interesting thing that the research actually shows too is that awareness component has a lot to do with our frontal lobe. And so what the research actually shows is that if our frontal lobe is not working properly, it makes it virtually impossible for us to actually identify our own emotions, those areas that we even need to potentially change. And certainly the frontal lobe also has a lot to do with managing our emotions and our relationships too. So, that a big component of EQ is actually improving frontal lobe capacity. And so, again, I think there's so much more we could say about that, but I think that's a good start. And I think Thank you, Sandra, because I think that really provides more motivation for us to actually dive into that topic more fully in a podcast coming up.
Definitely.
So another question that Sandra had, was related to overcoming insomnia. Now, I do want to skip down to another question we had on insomnia, and this is from Martine, because I think we can answer both of these questions at once. So Martine says, thank you so much for this topic. Insomnia. I have been struggling with insomnia for almost 2 years. I tried everything natural and sleep hygiene you recommended, and it did not work. 2 months ago, I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism. They gave me an antidepressant for my insomnia. The antidepressants are making me very weak and sick. Which other options do I have other than antidepressants? So, Dr. Katie, any thoughts there?
So I will kind of approach it from the general how to overcome insomnia, and then you can maybe touch more on the medication aspect. So in assessing for insomnia, we typically use 3 Ps: predisposing factors, precipitating factors, and then perpetuating factors. So people can start thinking about, there's some elements that I might be predisposed towards insomnia, and many of those we don't have control over, right? Females have higher rates of insomnia than males and so forth. But the precipitating factors, sometimes it's I work night shift, right? I work graveyard shift. And since then, that was a precipitating factor. Maybe I'm no longer working that shift, but that kind of really started my trouble with sleep. Or it might be a pregnancy, or it might be other factors that kind of was the precipitating factor. But then the last P is perpetuating. Are there things that I'm doing right now that's continuing that cycle or that difficulty? I know for Martine's question, it's a little bit different because this person mentioned that they have done a lot of the sleep hygiene factors, but maybe for Sandra or other people, there is an episode on insomnia addressing some of those factors, especially the perpetuating factors. And I've known several of my clients that I've worked with them and just identifying what's contributing to the insomnia in the first place. And many times by them addressing some of the sleep hygiene, they were able to overcome insomnia. I think there's also other elements of assessment that's really important, getting a sleep study or other things if it's more complicated than that. But there's a lot of factors that can contribute to insomnia. So I think the more that you understand your insomnia, the better you're able to tailor the treatment to your insomnia.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Dr. Katie, what you're saying there, because I think understanding as best we can the root issues that are triggering it, and that goes right along with, of course, sleep hygiene, but also even along the lines of, are there unresolved issues that need to be addressed? In other words, a lot of times we're like, oh, I've done the sleep hygiene things, but have we truly resolved a lot of our worries, for the day, for example? Because if there's like worries that are still hanging on and our mind just won't shut off because we're still like trying to process through those problems from the day, that can definitely trigger that. So, really working with a therapist and making sure there's not unresolved issues like related to worry, maybe depression, and maybe even things like unforgiveness, because maybe you're stewing about something and it's just like in the background bothering you. Along with, like you said, the sleep hygiene tips are really important. Now, when we start thinking about like actual medical interventions, we do want to look at those underlying issues. Sleep apnea is a big one that I run into again and again. So considering a sleep study can actually be really helpful for a lot of people. Sometimes people think, well, I'm not overweight, so I don't need to get a sleep study. There's no way that I have sleep apnea. I actually have several patients who are normal weight and still have sleep apnea. So that is one issue. Another thing, Martine, you mentioned the hypothyroidism. I've had several patients who, until their thyroid was appropriately regulated, it didn't matter what they did for their insomnia, it did not improve very well. So that is, to me, at the top of the list. You got to resolve as many of the medical issues as you possibly can. And in this case, the hypothyroidism. Also, when we start talking about supplements and medications, yeah, that's a whole discussion in and of itself, and so many options out there. There are some really good natural things that people can try, and I often recommend you can go online to do a little research there. Oftentimes, supplements that contain things like melatonin. I know there's mixed ideas on that. I do suggest that, especially for short term, it can be often helpful. Long term, probably not as great, but short term it can be helpful, especially if you combine it with things like chamomile, passion flower, L-theanine, lemon balm extract, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of combination supplements that can often be helpful. Medications, we don't have time to get into the details, obviously, but it's ideal to try to choose a medication that's not going to be habit forming or addicting. Now, sometimes that can be helpful, like some of those medications, even in the short term, but all those ones like Ambien and temazepam and these ones that people can get more dependent on, they have a big drawback that they can cause long-term cognitive effects. So you want to be careful. And even some of the ones that aren't as habit-forming, like over-the-counter, like Benadryl, for example, diphenhydramine, which is in a lot of sleep supplements, also can cause cognitive issues. So it is a very complex topic, but I think that at least touches on some of the important points. All right, so let's move on to anxiety. How can I leave my house to go out in public when I'm so afraid inside? And this is a great time for me to give my voice a break. Dr. Katie.
So I think this is an excellent question. I know a lot of people were struggling this before the pandemic, but so many more after the pandemic. So I think it's something, whoever sent it in, there's no name attached, but it's a great question. You can refer back to the episode on anxiety. We touch on this a little bit, but just to kind of reiterate, there's two main kind of approaches that are helpful. There's a cognitive approach, and then there's like the behavioral, specifically exposure therapy approach. So the cognitive approach is there are thoughts behind the anxiety, right? So why are you afraid of going outside, right? Sometimes for some people, they've experienced a trauma where, they were driving and so they don't want to drive anywhere anymore. Or sometimes, for the pandemic, it was related to anxiety of the virus. So a lot of times there's a thought or thoughts behind the anxiety. So why am I afraid? And with that, then we start challenging those thoughts. Are those thoughts true? Some people, it's afraid of, of people, of being in crowded places or so forth. And so it's identifying those thoughts and then working on those thoughts. What's true, what's not true, challenging them. I like to always say you put your thought on trial, but you give it a fair trial. You listen to the evidence for, evidence against, and then many times you start realizing these fears, although they feel to be very true, are irrational. Right? There's not evidence, or sometimes with this, there may be some evidence, but we're overestimating the risk of danger. So there might be some danger, but we're overestimating the risk. And then with that cognitive piece, that's part of it, but it's not enough unless we engage in the exposure therapy piece, which is basically facing our fears. So if we continue to tell ourselves over and over again, it's fine, but we're avoiding something, we're really telling our brain it's not fine. Right? If I'm avoiding the doorknob because I think I'm going to contract the virus and die and say, no, it's fine, but I keep on avoiding the doorknob, I'll tell myself, well, I'm still alive because I haven't touched the doorknob. So the only way to really overcome is by then engaging and facing our fears. Now, we can do it from an approach of basically desensitization or gradual exposure of if you're afraid of going outside of your house, you might start by, just going a step outside of your door, right? And then going to the mailbox and then going to the corner grocery store, right? And so forth. As you gain that confidence and you face that fear, that's the way that we truly kind of in a deeper rooted way address the underlying fears that then prevent us from wanting to leave the house.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think about that, idea of understanding, that's more in the logical part of our brain. But experientially, that actually moves more towards the emotional part of our brain, which is where the anxiety is. And so it's not until we actually have a new experience where we realize, like, okay, I went to the store and I actually was safe. Like, I was okay, and it ended up working out okay. Now it's not just an intellectual understanding, but the emotional part of your brain is starting to reaffirm, like, oh, okay, it wasn't as bad as I thought. And so the next time you go, there's less of a reaction, emotionally speaking. One thing that can be helpful that a lot of my patients actually use is, of course, getting some graded exposure and having a plan with a therapist. But sometimes even there's one medication that often is very helpful to reduce the reinforcement of the fear, and that's called propranolol. So that's something that, some of our listeners, if you're really struggling with this and you're trying the exposure and you're feeling stuck, you could talk to your doctor, your mental health professional about even considering propranolol, because that basically what it does is it helps to block the reinforcement of that fear. And they did one interesting study where they actually had people that had arachnophobia, so fear of spiders, and they gave them propranolol ahead of time, and then they exposed them to tarantulas. And after several sessions, these people were actually able to touch a tarantula. Now,
Wow.
I'm not even sure I would want to do that. I don't think I have an unrealistic fear of spiders, but to me, I was like, wow, that's pretty interesting. So that exposure therapy, it does really work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to add to kind of the reason why it works is the way that we learn is by pairing. So a lot of times we pair, so like in the classical studies, like for a little child there was I think it was a white bunny, right? And then they would do this loud bang. And so the kid associated bunny as dangerous. So there's this pairing. And so he would then be afraid of anything white and fuzzy, right? Other creatures as well. And so the only way for him to overcome the fear would be then to have the bunny without the bang, right? And so we can expose ourselves to unlearn what we learned before and realize the bunny itself is not dangerous. I was afraid of the bang that was associated with that bunny. And so exposure therapy helps to unlearn what we learned before, as well as to learn whatever whatever we're afraid of is not dangerous. Now, that means that we're assessing whether or not it actually is dangerous, because there are things that are dangerous. Like we are not saying to go touch tarantulas
Yeah.
or like rattlesnakes.
Thank you for the clarification
right?
there.
We do not want to approach something. We don't want to do exposure therapy of things that are actually dangerous. We have a beautiful alarm system that's anxiety to help us in those cases, but sometimes that alarm system needs to be recalibrated.
Then we can go and pet the bunny instead of running from the bunny, right?
Exactly, yes.
All right, so let's go on to Deanna on grief. I lost my son 2 months ago. The pain I feel is almost unbearable. I wish it was me that passed on. I've had everything, and my son's life was just beginning. So first of all, our hearts truly go out to you, Deanna. I can only imagine what you're going through. No one should have to experience such a loss. It's tragic, and dealing with grief is one of the most challenging things, especially when it's an unexpected death like that. So, Dr. Katie, do you have any thoughts on how we might help Deanna and others like her to find some resources or take some steps in the grieving process?
Yeah, and there's not enough time to really give this justice. Like, I just want to sit with Deanna and have a conversation. I'll refer to the episode on grief, and Karen Nicola, who's joined us on several episodes, is a really great resource, Comfort for the Day. So she has a website. She also has a workbook. And so there's going to be a lot more than what we can say in this little bit. I always like to just remind people that when they're going through grief, like the grief itself is a blessing. And the reason why I say that, it sounds in some ways, like a bad thing to say or an inconsiderate thing to say. But when we start realizing that the reason why we have such intense grief is because we were able to experience such intense love, right? It's how do I then take that and continue to remember that love? Because one of the things that people typically do with grief that's actually not helpful is they try to forget or they try to, avoid thinking of those things. But it's actually by remembering and by really being intentional about living out the memory of that individual is where people find most healing. And so for Deanna, I would encourage you to just really reflect on the blessing of the time that you've had with your son. And then how do I intentionally live a life that continues to give remembrance of him? Right. And it's beautiful to also think. I just had a client yesterday talking about grief, and she was saying how, you'll find, somebody told her this, you'll find qualities of that person that you lost in other people. But then I also told her there's qualities that you have in yourself. And so in some ways, you can continue to live out that person's life through your own choices. And so as a mother, right, the world no longer has the presence of your son, but how do you live a life intentionally to continue his memory?
I love that. And it's kind of like a legacy idea in a way. And really, in a way, you're honoring their legacy by, you might even choose aspects of who they really were that you valued and say, you know what, I want to foster more of that in my own life. And then it can be a truly beautiful opportunity. And, a couple other aspects, and like you said, we don't have time to delve into the details, but I do think it's really important to, even though you're not going to feel like it, take care of yourself, like do self-care. And, the basics sometimes, just sleeping, eating, taking walks, and trying to minimize isolation. Now, it's okay to spend some time alone. It's okay to have time to cry, to be sad. Those are important. But you also don't want to be overly isolated and shut, especially those out that really love you and want to be there to support you. There might be some people where you're like, you know what? Maybe they're not the best people for me right now, and that's okay. But those people that are safe, they really want to be there for you and can be there for you in a healthy way, don't shut them out completely. And get professional help if you need it, And we have an online grief course, like Dr. Katie mentioned. There's a lot of resources that Karen Nicola actually has on her Comfort for the Day website. Our online grief course is with Karen Nicola. So that would be an opportunity to engage in that if you go to beautifulmindswellness.org. And, one thing that Karen does often talk about is journaling. And so processing through this, and it doesn't matter what you write. You don't have to, there's no format here. It's just like allow whatever is going to come out on the paper to come out. And I think that can be a very healthy, helpful way of processing through the grief and allowing yourself to start that healing journey.
Yeah, and then just one other thing that came to mind is I saw this image of grief that was really helpful. It was like this black ball, and it says we typically think of grief by it thinking that it gets smaller and smaller over time. But actually, grief looks like it stays the same, but it was in a jar. The jar gets bigger. And it was this idea that nobody can replace this person, right? So for Deanna, nobody can replace her son. There's nothing that can be really done to fill that void, to get rid of that grief. But you grow around it. You continue to live life. You continue to make connections. You continue, and that touches on the piece of isolation, continue to live your life intentionally, right? Because we want to just stop life. We want to just, get sucked into this darkness of grief. But how do I still hold on to that grief in the sense of grieving the loss of somebody that was so meaningful, but how do I still live life, taking care of myself, doing the things that make me passionate about how can I live my life in memory of this person? And so you grow around it. And over time, it may seem smaller, but you still live with that person's memory.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's move on to our next question. This is from Billy on motivation. After receiving COVID, a relative has been left with an underlying theme of not feeling motivated. It was not apparent before getting COVID. There are no physical symptoms that can be found. There are no reasons in their life that would warrant this. Things are going fine in all aspects of their life. but the reoccurring theme is unmotivated. Is there a diagnosis or explanation for being unmotivated?
So I know that you actually have looked into this more. So I'll actually you read it, but it goes back to you, Dr. Binus.
All right. So, the interesting thing here is that COVID, and especially what we call long COVID, has a lot of elements related to mental health, and mental health is very closely related to motivation, especially depression. One study actually showed that when people have mental distress before getting COVID, for example, they might have significant levels of stress, anxiety, depression, or even loneliness, that they were actually 32 to 46% increased likelihood of developing long COVID. So, what are we talking about with long COVID? The symptoms can kind of vary, but generally speaking, we're talking about fatigue, we're talking about brain fog, and oftentimes symptoms that can be related to anxiety or depression, especially the lethargy, the lack of motivation, etc. So it is very possible that this individual that you're talking about, Billy, actually has at least some aspects of long COVID and may actually be depressed. Hard to say, but that would be one area to evaluate. And, even if they're not depressed, again, it is common and frequent for people to develop these symptoms. So, one of the things that the scientists are really looking at is what is causing this. And at this point, the answer is we don't know, but it does seem to probably have to do with elements of inflammation in the brain, especially, and the immune system in general, that haven't really fully cooled down after COVID. And so, people are trying different things to try to help these symptoms. And there are both non-pharmacologic and then more pharmacologic type interventions that are being tried. So some of the pharmacologic interventions include things like methylphenidate, which is Ritalin, donepezil, which is actually a medication that they use for dementia and memory loss, modafinil, which is a medication that is used to help people be more alert, luteolin, and then, yeah, these are actually some vitamins like luteolin, nicotinamide riboside, vitamin C, or even sometimes probiotics. And then also a family of herbs called adaptogens. So these are things that they're trying, doesn't work for everyone, but these are things that can be tried. There's also non-pharmacologic interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy, graded exercise therapy, and rehabilitation and strategies in general. So again, there is probably an explanation for your relatives or acquaintances' low motivation, but it's probably related, at least to some degree, to some aspect of long COVID. And there are some things you can do, but there's not a one-size-fits-all intervention or solution. All right. Katie, I don't know if you have any other comments on that.
No.
Okay.
Great explanation. Very thorough.
All right. So we are at our last question. This is from Bernard on godly choices. How can I choose my Creator's will every moment of my life?
So I love the question because I think already asking that question is already getting you closer to the answer, right? Just the desire already to want to choose his will. And I even like that they emphasized every moment of my life, because I think many times we think about just like some events, like big events where I had a conversion experience or I came to Christ and, okay, I gave my will over to him. But it is a moment to moment decision and choice. And It reminds me of the verse that talks about to take your cross up daily, right? It's something that we need to commit daily. And so I think a practical thing is every time we wake up, right, to have that choice of God, I want to surrender my will to you today. And one thing that I actually recommend is to even do this in the evening before the next day. So I'm a huge proponent of evening time with God because it really sets your mood for the next day. And, for people during biblical times, it was actually like evening to evening. And I noticed that when people are reading, good content, uplifting content at night or singing, they often wake up in the morning singing that very song or thinking about that scripture. And so it's not just about yes in that morning, but I think even in that evening saying, God, I surrender everything to you today. And then the next morning, you're waking up already with that decision to submit your will to Him. I also think about whenever people ask me about following God's will, I tend to always go to Proverbs 16. And Proverbs 16, there's several verses, but the one that we often quote, and let me just find it here. We often quote verse 9. It says, "A man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps." And often we misquote this. We misquote it from the perspective of like, you have your own plans, but then God just comes in and is like, nope, this is the way to do it. But the word directs in the original actually is better understood as establishes. And so you plan your way, and God just comes and says, yeah, you already following my will. I established that. And the reason why is in the context of that chapter in verses 1 and 2, it says, the preparations of the heart belong to a man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. But then it goes on to basically say in verse 3, commit your works to the Lord and your thoughts will be established. It's the idea that if you choose to already submit your whole heart to God, right, you're already following His will, and then you can have the confidence that He's directing. And so I think the willingness itself and just surrendering that to Him, and then He trusting that He will do everything else.
I love that. And, to piggyback on that, the idea of really making that intentional choice in the morning, I think is critical. And part of what I try to choose too is to say, God, I want to choose to be aware if I'm getting off of the track that you want me to be on today. And so, we talked about emotional intelligence and the awareness piece there, and that's EQ, right? And I almost think that we also need to work on developing maybe SQ, like a spiritual, intelligence quotient, so to speak. And I think a big part of that is just, realizing that God is wanting to be with us every moment, and He is with us every moment. But are we aware of Him, and are we in tune with Him? Are we open and sensitive enough to the Holy Spirit when He's trying to speak to us and say, well, you know what, maybe you should do this a little bit differently? And again, I'm a very focused person. I get my mind like made up, I'm doing this. But if we give God permission to interrupt that focus and say, God, today, whatever it takes, just get my attention if I'm getting off track, I believe He will. And I believe that as we go on that journey with the Lord in our lifetime, that we actually can get more sensitive to that still small voice redirecting us and guiding us. And then it becomes this really beautiful like experience where we realize we're never alone, and we really have the opportunity of walking with God all the time. And, I'll be the first to say, I'm not there. But, I also see the progression in my spiritual journey, and it starts to be really exciting when you experience that, because you realize, you know what, I don't have to carry the burdens that on my own, that God's right here with me. And more and more naturally, like when I'm coming into problems and issues, whether it's with a patient or with my family or just personally, it is slowly becoming more natural to turn to Him and say, okay, God, I need your help with this.
I love that, giving Him permission to interrupt. And I think also one thing that's really important is structuring your life in a way that gives Him the opportunity to interrupt or to hear his voice. So when we talk about kind of mindfulness and trying to be more aware of our emotions, but also more aware of the Holy Spirit, one of the biggest barriers to mindfulness and being aware is a fast-paced, busy, overworked life. So if we're rushing to and fro, God may want to interrupt us. He may be actually speaking or yelling in a very trying to be obvious way, but we're so consumed that even God can't, go beyond that. So He can't go beyond our choice to live a structure of a life that doesn't give Him permission to step in. So I know for myself, included, of being mindful of my schedule and my time. Do I have moments where I can pause? Do I have moments where I can listen if He's speaking?
Into the quiet, right? And I love that text that says, be still and know that I am God. And when I think about that knowing aspect, that is the intimacy that He wants to experience with us. And if we are in such a rush all the time, and I'm speaking here to myself because I'm a very busy person, can we really have that stillness to have that intimacy with God? Well, that's all the time we have today. So thank you, Dr. Katie. And thank you to our listeners for all the questions. Keep them coming. They keep us learning and growing. And it's always fun to answer these questions. And thank you all for bearing with my voice. We got through it. So may you all be blessed.
So if you only take one thing away from today's show, remember this. If mental illness is a whole person problem, then it must have a whole person solution. I'm Dr. Katie Cruz.
And I'm Dr. Daniel Binus, and you've been listening to
the Brain People Podcast.
Thanks for listening. To hear more episodes, find us on social media, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.